We are born free.
And we will die free.
The time in between, though,
That's complicated.
in that time, governments, institutions, and our egos will limit our ability to find true freedom in this life. These are real stories of real people overcoming the odds, persevering in justice, and unlocking their potential. Welcome to Finding Freedom. Here's your host, John Odermatt.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another edition of Finding Freedom right here on the Lions of Liberty podcast. And man, I got another great show lined up for you guys today. Before we get to it, just want to remind everyone, if you've been listening to the show for a while, or even if this is your first or second time listening and you like what you hear, please, we would really appreciate it if you would consider going to iTunes or whatever app you're listening to this on. Give it a 5-star review, give it a 5-star rating, and leave us a nice little review. Would be appreciated. And hit that subscribe button. I mean, with what Mark on his Monday show, Brian on his Wednesday show with Electric Liberty Land, and myself on Thursdays with Finding Freedom, what we try to deliver to you is the best value you can get in a variety show type podcast. And we're bringing you, great interviews on Monday with leaders in philosophy and the Liberty Movement and entrepreneurship. And Wednesday, Brian McWilliams is giving one of the most unique takes on culture and current events and putting his comedic spin on things. Just a great show. And myself on Thursday, of course, what I've tried to do recently with my change is expand and really look at life as a whole, not just the criminal justice system, but through business ownership and through different things that we can do in our lives to apply the principles of liberty and overcome obstacles and find freedom in our own life. That's my goal with this show. So please support us. If you haven't yet, really consider even supporting us and becoming a patron. We have some great giveaways. Great stuff that you get access to, bonus content, stuff like that, all kinds of merchandise, depending on the level that you join. Access at our Nittany level and above, you get to actually produce a show and tell us what you want us to talk about. So check that out, patreon.com/Lions of Liberty. And I really hope you guys enjoy today's show. I got a really awesome guest for you today. My guest today on Finding Freedom is Dr. Eric Larson. He is a clinical assistant professor of anesthesiology at Michigan State University College of Human Medicine. He is also in private practice and is board certified in anesthesiology, where he specializes in ambulatory and perioperative acute pain, see if I'm saying that right, and general anesthesia. Eric is the host of the Paradocs podcast. It's a fun and lively discussion with a couple of docs on the practice of medicine. It's occasionally serious, usually lighthearted, and accidentally informative. I stole that from the little iTunes about there. And Eric, welcome to Finding Freedom.
Thanks so much for having me. It's actually perioperative medicine. So anyway, that's how you pronounce that. It's funny because my son is 14 and I always tease him about what I do at work, and I'll tell him I do what ERCP, which people might have heard of, and it's actually endoscopic retrograde cholangiopancreatography, but no one actually ever says that except I do just to mess with them. So anyway, so we do all that sort of things in medicine. We charge twice as much if we use the proper medical terms.
Yeah, if the patients can't pronounce the words, that means it's worth it, right? It's more
Absolutely.
expensive. So, Eric, I wanted to have you on for a while, and I finally reached out throughout this. I think if I should say, first of all, I think you've been on Mark's show, which is our Monday program, and also on Brian's show, Electric Liberty Land. So now this is the trifecta. So this is bound to happen eventually, I'm sure. But what I was saying was, through this whole past year, the SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19 pandemic we've been going through, I've really been interested, since you have such a better knowledge base than I do to talk about this stuff. But I think more importantly, the way you've talked about it in a very nonpartisan way, just giving the raw facts, the raw data to a lot of your live videos that I've watched on Facebook, which I think are also your podcasts. So if you just want to talk about that, sort of how you've approached the pandemic in that manner.
Yeah, I think to begin with, I'm not really very partisan. I've tried the Republican Party; it didn't fit, and I was there pretty much as long as my friend Justin Amash was a part of it, and then you sort of wore out your welcome pretty quickly, even before he was done there as well. And so I've never been very partisan. I'm definitely, my politics are libertarian, and so I tend not to have a home. And so when the both sides start yelling at each other, I can easily tune it out. And I think you probably are in the same boat too. Like you kind of see the nonsense that they spout, and then it's mainly, whatever the other person's not saying is what my position is. And so it's been made very strange sort of following this debate, I guess I will call it, for the last year and a half. And for me, from a clinical standpoint, or at least scientific standpoint, it's been a process of discovery and learning, because as an anesthesiologist, we don't know much about immunology or epidemiology, infectious disease. I mean, I give antibiotics during a surgery, but it's pretty much always the same one. So it's not, it's pretty much unthinking. I mean, I know the basics from medical school, but I don't know a whole lot of specifics. And so I can talk to people who are in the field, and I understand the lingo, and I can understand sort of the basic things, the concepts that we talk about, risk benefit, when it comes to trying to figure out what to do. My wife is a pediatrician, so I know a lot about vaccinations, and sort of, I hear about us all the time. We have discussions, I'll call them, all the time about vaccinations and what are good strategies, not. And anyway, so I have some sort of like knowledge base that I use, and I think just generally just a curious person. And since I'm not partisan, I'm not beholden to sort of one camp, if we'll call it that at this point. I tend to err on the side of trusting regular people and trusting myself and instincts and common sense versus just trusting someone just because they have a title. And so I wouldn't expect anyone to trust everything I say because I have MD after my name, nor would I expect just because someone's a government official to trust everything they say. And I would hope that people find ways of understanding things that make sense to them, but also that some people recognize that this is something that no one's ever gone through before, no matter what kind of expert you are. No one has lived through this sort of scenario with a pandemic. And so we have to recognize this has to be a lot of humility. And there are a lot of things I've been wrong about with this, or what I expected with this pandemic. I think I've been pretty open and honest about it, and open and honest about what I don't know. But also I think there's a lot of stuff that people say with certainty that they have no way of knowing. And I think I like to think that I try and approach it where I have, again, some intellectual curiosity and recognition that I might be wrong, but also willingness to call out the people who are just, full of it, which is there are plenty of.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the mantra now is, trust the experts, which is dangerous. Experts, their opinions should be taken and should be analyzed, and there's different experts saying different things. So it's really, they're not saying trust the experts. They're saying trust our approved experts and ignore these other experts over here. But it's a difficult time to sift through all this. I kind of wanted to start out painting the picture here for COVID-19 and what I've seen from your work. I think one thing you've talked about, I don't know when you first started mentioning this aspect of it, that SARS-CoV-2 will eventually evolve into pretty much a strain of the common cold. And I've seen you say that. I've seen other people say the same thing. What is that? What's that based upon? It's not purely a guess. I mean, the current, coronavirus strains that are the common cold, I guess they likely did a similar thing to this. They started off more extreme. Is that the thought process? Yeah,
I think, when you look at, when it comes to this sort of thing, obviously no one can know, right? And so it's only a guess. It really is actually a conjecture that, this will end up a common cold, and that'll be something that we sort of are used to having around. We're around viruses, we're around infectious diseases all the time. So when you look at coronavirus, the question is really, what can we look at through history and have some sort of insight into what might happen in the future? It is absolutely conjecture to know what's going to happen with this SARS-CoV-2. This is the 5th coronavirus that has boot transfer to humans that we know of, where actually humans can replicate it. Coronaviruses are very common in the environment. All sorts of animal species have it, but rarely do they work in multiple mammals. And so that when they do, that's when you have problems. And so right now, this SARS-CoV-2 is going to be present we think it can be replicated in mice and mink. There are probably some other mammals. And so that suggests that it will become endemic, which means it's never going to go away. And so if you think that this is never going to go away, do we have other examples of this? And this is when I've spoken to my friend, Dr. David Graham, who's an infectious disease physician in Montana. We talk about, have we seen this before, right? So when you look at coronavirus, I think, we have to look at the past to try and understand the future. And that's the best way of understanding where we're going to go. And it doesn't guarantee, where the path is going to be, but it certainly gives you insights into sort of how things might happen. And so OC43 is the most recent coronavirus that we're aware of. One of the 4 current endemic ones that cause a upper respiratory infection, a common cold, that traveled from cows to humans probably in the late 1800s. You can see news reports from then, and you see evidence that it existed at that point. There's other sort of ways of figuring this out. But at the time, you read the reports, it was not as bad as what we're seeing now for sure. But certainly people got pretty sick. Some people died. And over time, this now becomes sort of a ubiquitous virus. And so it is probable, I think, in probably more than 50%, that this will actually turn into a virus that if you're young and exposed to it, you sort of develop T-cell immunity or some sort of immunity that protects you in the future exposures while you're an adult. If you're an adult, you've never had an opportunity to see this particular strain. And so it's likely to be a little harder on your immune system and for your body to respond to it. I'm kind of dumb. And so I like trying to use analogies in medicine that maybe are suggestive of this process. And I think the chickenpox is a good one that most people are familiar with. So if you get the chickenpox when you're 6, you get the chickenpox, you're sick for a couple of weeks or whatever, and then you're okay. If you're a 60-year-old person who gets chickenpox for the first time as an exposure, most people know you can get really, really sick and potentially die from it. And so I kind of tend to think that's a little bit what this is, that you have no previous exposure and at a young age, we don't really understand a lot of immunology. And so I think even you'd ask the immunologist, like, can you explain immunology? The first answer would be, well, it's complicated, right? And so I think there's a lot that goes on that we don't understand, and that's okay. But again, I think you just look at what has happened before and see what would happen likely in the future. You look at kids right now and they're 12, 14, 13, 14-year-olds. Most of them, if you do serology studies, will have shown multiple exposures to all these common cold varieties, adenoviruses, rhinoviruses, coronaviruses, parainfluenza viruses. All these things cause various types of colds and inflammations and reactions from people. So they've been exposed multiple times while they're young. And we don't normally think of the cold killing people because that's why we call it the common cold. It's not a big deal. We wouldn't bother developing a virus or a vaccine for it because, you just get sick, you feel kind of lousy for a while. People who have asthma might get more sick than others or whatever. And if you get really old and you're frail, you might succumb to them. But essentially, the viruses are just going to be kind of a nuisance. But probably at some point, when it first jumped from another mammal species into humans, it probably is more than a nuisance. We don't know because we have no recorded history of this. It's interesting to think about what would have happened in 1890s when the first coronavirus came across. Would it have been, and they have the knowledge that we have now, maybe then, people would have freaked out sort of like they are now and looked for ways to fix things. I mean, I don't know. But I think a key thing is to say the coronavirus is not like the flu virus. They are totally different types of viruses. And that's why the approach to combating them and things like that has to be recognized as different as well. So that's another important point.
So when it comes to go back to kids and kids not really getting, I mean, there have been kids that have gotten pretty sick from this, obviously, but for the most part, kids are not really impacted, don't have bad outcomes from coronavirus, from this version of the coronavirus, the SARS-CoV-2. So why is the approach, or what are some of the reasons why would the approach be different than chickenpox, where, with chickenpox, you really don't worry about your kid getting chickenpox. Often when I was a kid, there were chickenpox parties, or if your brother got chickenpox, the mom tries to get the whole family to get chickenpox. Now I know there's a little difference with this. You don't want to get the kids sick and then the kids infect the adults. But with regards to like school, do you think that we could have maybe set up a better model to get kids back in school, being that they're not in danger of getting really ill from this?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think part of that is, and I won't put a lot of blame on people because, we haven't experienced this particular virus and sort of what it causes in the disease process. people would be much more freaked out about this if it even is as dangerous as the flu for children. I mean, you have a lot more kids in the hospital, you have a lot more deaths because basically no one has any basic underlying immunity. And but that's not the case with SARS-CoV-2. I mean, I think with the variants, you're probably seeing higher likelihood of transmission with younger children, which has changed the game a little bit as far as transmission. And maybe they get a little bit sicker. But right now, we still have a disease that pretty much primarily affects old people. I mean, that's the main target. But I think a lot of the strategy makes sense in the sense that if you look at prior infections, and the main one we look at is because one we deal with every year is the flu. And the major vector for transmitting flu in a community is actually through the schools. You'll see this when there's a winter break, suddenly the flu goes away in the community. Kids come back to school, flu takes off again. And so it was, I think, a rational sort of thought, like, well, we have a bunch of kids stuck together. If you're no one who's a teacher, they know these kids get them sick all the time, right? Kids, especially young children, all they do is have their nose running all the time, right? All winter long, right? They have one cold after another. They're hardly ever okay. And so it wasn't irrational, I think, to sort of close things down. I mean, after a while, it became apparent that was not the case. It was pretty clear by fall that that schools was not where the major spread was. Is certainly with, whatever you think of the interventions to try and control spread with masks and things like that, whether they're effective or not, I don't know. And I don't pretend to know. But either way, there just wasn't a lot of transmission in the school. So I think we probably could have opened up a lot sooner. I mean, my son's been in high school the whole time, except when my governor shut us down, and they've had really no spread within their high school at all. And those are older kids too. But anyway,
so high schools have been open in Michigan? Really?
Yes, it just depends where you are.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's sort of like, if you're in a large urban area, there tends not to be. And then the suburban areas are or aren't. I mean, where my son would have gone to school. So he's in a charter school. So I think that's important to point out. Charter schools and private schools have been pretty much open for the most part. And then the public schools, even the suburban areas, it's random, right? Like they're off again, on again, whatever. And so it's really just been sort of hodgepodge. The urban areas, like I'm near outside of Grand Rapids, City of Detroit, Grand Rapids, a couple other large urban centers have been totally closed down all year, and they haven't bothered trying, or they open up and kids still learn virtually when they go into the schools, which is totally insane. But, they hire teachers to go, or what do they call them? Para teachers or something. It's like a paralegal, the teacher, someone just goes in to help them,
help your
them.
podcast name there. Paradocs.
Yeah, right. Exactly. But anyway, so I don't think it was like a totally crazy idea to think that we need one of the ways to control community spread of a virus that we have to try and buy time because we didn't know what was going to happen. And certainly the reports out of Italy at the time. And then, New York City was really bad and people didn't know what they're doing. There was no protective equipment for healthcare workers. I mean, it was kind of a scary time because really no one knew what was going on. And I think, and so I think a lot of those reactions were not totally irrational. I mean, by the time we hit summer or fall, it seemed like they're kind of silly. But anyway, I think that was the main strategy. The thought was kids are going to be a vector because they are a vector for most diseases. I mean, kids are just kind of walking, as my immunology professor said in medical school, they're pretty much walking petri dishes. And so they, if something's going to happen, they're going to bring it into the house or take it wherever. It just, for whatever reason, it has not been the case for this coronavirus. And maybe it's not for other ones too. I don't know, but I know parents know their kids get them sick all the time. And so they could be coronaviruses too, but for whatever reason, it just hasn't been the case with this virus.
Yeah, it's been interesting. And my we've been lucky that she's 5 years old now. She has her last day of preschool tomorrow, graduates on Wednesday, but they've been open. Her preschool's been open, not the entire time, but since last fall, they've remained open, and they do have some masking inside and stuff like that. But when they're outside, they don't have to wear masks. But that's been great that she's been able to go through preschool, since I know, it's the same thing in Pennsylvania. It's kind of area by area, school district by school district, how it breaks down. Kind of just all politics, which is not good.
Right. Well, and that's been the most frustrating thing about this completely, right? It's because you have people on sides, and I would say the people on both sides are kind of acting crazy. And, maybe you'd say people on the left are a little bit crazier because they're just insisting on not letting go of this pandemic. But I feel like the same people who say, well, COVID-19 is not real, or it's just the same as the flu as far as it's how deadly and dangerous it is. I mean, I don't know how you can look at the evidence and say that that's the case. Maybe you could argue, well, because no one's ever had coronavirus, that if no one had ever had any sort of flu, it'd be just as bad. I don't know. I guess you could make that argument. But uh, it has been frustrating, but it also has been a puzzle, right? I mean, if you kind of take away the noise from the political sides, and I think the fact that happened in election year was a really bad thing with a guy who is extremely right. Had this happened in 2019 or 2021, it would have been, I think, entirely different sort of outcome and sort of how we would have approached this. I think, because I think people were using it opportunistically to really drive agendas and to win, political power. I think has been part of the problem.
Just to interject quickly with Trump, I think he's not built. He was not built for handling a pandemic, whichever way you look at it. He was not built for it. I don't know if Joe Biden is better, but I mean, I don't like Joe Biden's policies any better. But Trump did not handle it in a good fashion. He fumbled everything that he could do. He did wrong.
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right, and I think you look at the bureaucracy, the CDC, the only thing they have to do is try and prevent infectious diseases. And they've basically done everything wrong in this entire endeavor. And they're still making bad decisions now. Same thing with the FDA. And Trump is a guy who just was trying to get attention, and he likes controversy. He's not really a deep thinker, obviously. That was pretty clear. And, in a time when there's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of fear, the last thing you need is someone like throwing wood on the fire, right? I mean, he was the exact opposite kind of person you'd want. I mean, even Biden might have been better, even though he's confused and doesn't know where he is. I think he would have at least wouldn't have at least been really ignited the flames. And that was, part Trump, part media, whatever you can argue. But
it's a good point. Yeah. Media,
I think that
probably media at least half responsible.
I mean, they fed off each other, right? He was successful because of the media was successful because of him. The more controversy and things they could rile up, they both won, right? He got notoriety and fame, and they got ratings. And so anyway, I think it was like a perfect storm for the 2020.
It was, yeah. It was something I never want to see or live through again from a political standpoint. So getting less controversial, just kidding. Let's turn the page and talk about vaccines. So just starting out, just talking about adults. I don't want to characterize your opinion, but it seems like you're generally in favor of adults getting vaccinated.
I would say if you just pick generally, so I'm vaccinated, my wife's vaccinated, my daughter's in college who hasn't had COVID is vaccinated. My son, who's a freshman in high school, he'll get vaccinated. Now we're a little bit more pro-vaccine, probably just in general, because my wife's a pediatrician and that's what she does. I guess I don't, medicine comes down to risks and benefits. And I think, there are absolutely unknown risks for things that we don't fully understand. Like I think the vaccine, as far as long-term effects, we don't really know what the long-term effects are. There are lots of things we don't know the long-term effects of anything. And statistics, unfortunately, are either there's a percentage of whatever may happen, but ultimately for you, it's 0 or 100. You just don't know which one it is, right? It's either not going to happen or it's going to happen. Mm-hmm. And so I think, when you look at COVID-19 and you look at the disease itself, it's clear that if you're old, you're at much higher risk of bad things happening. Even if you don't die, and you say with mortality rates, I don't know, 7% or whatever it is, there are other kinds of problems. You're like down for 3 months and you're not breathing well. You're feeling miserable. I always tell people, like when they ask me if I'm getting vaccinated, I say, well, I get the flu vaccine and maybe I'm a bad person, but I don't get it to protect the community. I get it because I don't like getting the flu, and I've had the flu and it's pretty lousy, and I don't like being out of work for a couple of weeks and just feeling just miserable. And so that's why I get the vaccine. I was very confident with the mRNA vaccine that it was a pretty good vaccine, that it is effective, which is a miracle. I mean, I think, in many ways, libertarians should almost be like celebrating the free market here and the technological advances we have and the wealth that our country has that we can develop something like this. So
are you able to, just to interject there, and I know it's probably way too detailed for a podcast like this, but in layman's terms, are you able to describe the difference between a mRNA vaccine and a traditional vaccine? Yeah.
So, about the best I could do, John, is actually do it in layman's terms, since I can't have anesthesiology. But I understand it generally speaking. So most vaccines are going to, well, I guess we'll back up. A vaccine is designed for you to get an immunological response to an immunity from some sort of pathogen, a virus or bacteria. And so it is a way of mimicking and so basically tricking your body into making an immune response so that you have future immunity if you get exposed to that pathogen. So for instance, like you get a measles, mumps, rubella vaccination when you're young, baby, you get a series of that to produce antibodies for measles, mumps, and rubella. So what happens, and there are different types of vaccines. Most of the vaccines traditionally have either a live activated or an inactivated particle of some protein of the virus or bacteria, whatever it is you're getting vaccinated from, that will cause your immune system to say, hey, that's something foreign. I'm going to produce some antibodies, and then my antibodies system. So I'll have this cascade, and you may get a reaction of some sort of inflammation or some sort of feeling tired or sore throat or something like that, or sore arm. That's an inflammatory reaction. You will then develop antibodies. You'll have certain of your immune cells, the T cells, will have some memory. You'll have some B cells as well that are involved in the antibody production, and they will have some memory so that the next time they see this, they'll right away say, hey, I know that's foreign, and that is, measles or whatever. Mm-hmm. And then it produces antibody and prevents you from getting the cascade of the disease, whatever it is. And there are inactivated ones, which means it's just like a part of the virus. There might be an activated one in which it gives you a very weakened one of a part of the virus, because we can, modify it so that you used to have to draw them in cell cultures, but so that it's just like, it's not really able to get you really sick unless you're immunocompromised. And so those are some people who get the vaccination that get really sick because they get an actual infection, even though that wasn't meant to. The messenger RNA is different in that it basically does cause the same reaction essentially, except instead of having, except it mimics an actual viral infection a lot better than the vaccines that you might give, like with like the Johnson would be a good example. So that's like they give you adenovirus, which is from, I think, chimpanzee or something like that. And that actually, they just flood you with tons of these viruses, all those proteins around, your body creates an immune reaction. Where the messenger RNAs, they actually deliver, they have fat basically surrounding a very small particle, that's some RNA, which is a code. It's basically like a blueprint for making stuff. It gets into the cells because it's just very small and it's got it's fat, it's lipid soluble. It gets into your cells, and the cells are basically tricked. And whenever they get RNA, they say, "Oh, I got to do this." And so cells are not that sophisticated. They just kind of do what they're told. The information, they're sort of the rule book they get, and they start making these proteins. They're making proteins. In this case, a spike protein, which is what's used by the SARS-CoV-2 in order to attach to your cells to get into the cells. And so normally, what a SARS-CoV-2 does, or the coronavirus that we think of, it attaches your cell, it gets in, it basically takes over your cell functions, and it just starts producing more viruses. And then what your body does eventually is it recognizes that cell is evil. It's producing the virus, and it kills those cells. I mean, your body's always killing its own cells, cancer cells, foreign cells that are defective, old, and, broken down and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And so essentially what this does is it mimics that sort of process, except it's not actually causing it's not causing the actual production of a virus. So you can't actually get sick per se. You just produce those proteins. It doesn't get into your cell nucleus, so it's not like changing DNA or anything like that. It just sits outside in your cell and producing. It's really pretty, remarkable technology. It's pretty amazing. And there'll probably be a lot of other applications in the future for curing all sorts of different things, now that we have a delivery device.
It was designed, wasn't Moderna founded in order to use mRNA to treat cancer? Is that?
Yeah. That's what Moderna actually stands for, right? They just added some vowels, but it's mRNA. So that's why.
Okay.
So anyway, yeah, it's exactly. And so I think that will be sort of the future of a lot. I think vaccines will change. I think they'll be a lot more efficient this way. And anyway, I think it's very promising. The one thing, of course, we don't know is we don't know what this vaccine will do long term. We don't know how long immunity lasts and those sorts of things. And those you can't know until time passes. And then, of course, long-term effects of anything is really hard to sort of determine. And especially in large populations there's more brain cancers or things like that. That's what people worry about who are mm-hmm. hesitant for vaccines. And so kind of circling back to your initial question about vaccines, what do I think? I think you should do what you think is best. And so that's what I believe. And I just personally believe that a vaccine makes sense. This is not a common cold. For some people it is, but you don't know if you're that person who is. If you're older, or you have some sort of health problems, or you're exposed to it a lot or something like that, or you're worried about it, then I think it's perfectly reasonable to go get the vaccine. If you're someone who said, yeah, I don't need it, I don't think you need it. If you're someone who's had COVID-19, I think it's probably a bad idea to get vaccinated. And that's contrary to what's being
that is.
pushed by the CDC and FDA. And actually, I just had someone that would be on the next episode, an immunologist, and we talked about that. And he thinks it's totally crazy because, and he's someone who's actually fairly left of center from his politics, but he's like, this is a really bad strategy by the CDC and the FDA, encouraging people who have been infected and cleared it, which we know have been infected, to then go out and get vaccinated. Because in medicine, you have risk and benefit. If we know that you have got full antibodies and you've got full immunity to something, which we know you get with a natural infection, we have studies that prove this. And actually your immunity is probably as good, if not better, than it is with a vaccine, which should come as no shock to anybody. I mean, this is like, I don't know, again, that's like common sense, but also it's like basic immunology. That if you've got that immunity, then you're provided no benefit from getting a vaccine. So if there's even a minuscule amount of harm, well, then you've actually done something that's maybe even you argue is unethical, right? If you've pushed something, right? Because if it's going to provide no benefit, it's like, if you come in and I don't know, you just come for a well check and I say, you know what, you need some antibiotics. And so I give you some antibiotics and you've got no infection. Now, most likely you take the antibiotics and nothing's going to happen. But if you even get just diarrhea or some stomach upset, well, I've caused you harm with actually providing no benefit. And so what I've done is wrong. Now, that would be pretty minor. But what if you had anaphylaxis or some other thing? Then how would you justify doing that if that happened? And so I think, that's where it comes down to risk benefit. If you've had COVID-19, I think it's clearly a bad idea. Now, there are people all kinds of patients I run into who insist that they had COVID-19 in 2019 or, in January of 2020. I'm almost certain they all had just colds or flus or something else because it was a bad flu season. But people just didn't get, tested for that. You can always test for antibodies if you're not sure. There are other ways of figuring this out. But I think, when it came to the government, they pushed the vaccinations and they pushed you even if you had it, because they didn't want to bother slowing things down and adding an extra step of getting tested.
Yeah. So just to touch on a couple of things you said there. And I think throughout this whole thing, we've really seen the elderly and people in nursing homes kind of be abused at the outset. We didn't do a good job protecting them. Obviously things that happened in New York with Cuomo and Pennsylvania with Governor Wolf, putting COVID positive patients back in nursing homes was terrible. But also I've seen happen in nursing homes that people, residents there who had coronavirus, even recently within the past month, then they came through with vaccines and just vaccinated everybody. And I think it's just trying to get those numbers up, trying to get that count up when, really, from my perspective, I'm not a doctor, but just from my, perspective, looking at it logically, like you said, I love I'm a risk analyst by trade. So the cost benefit, analysis, that's how I look at everything. And there's no, you're 90 years old and you just beat COVID. Why would you get a vaccine? There's no point. But from my personal perspective on the vaccine, I'm not anti-vaccine. I have not been vaccinated. My wife hasn't been, my daughter can't yet, and she won't be. But from our perspective, we are trying to have more kids, and we don't want to introduce another unknown variable into that equation. So that's our perspective on it. Both my parents have been vaccinated. They're in their 70s, which I think is a good decision on their part. So I'm not anti-vaccine, but I look at it just like most things in life from a cost benefit analysis. Yeah.
But I think, when it comes to I think chickenpox is a good example because children are now vaccinated for chickenpox for the most part. But when they first introduced the vaccine, they would ask you, have you had chickenpox? Well, if you had chickenpox, we know that immunity lasts for life. You wouldn't vaccinate those people. And so it doesn't make any sense that we do that right now. And when you look at antibody levels, and there's no reason to do it. Again, it just introduces harm. The bigger question for parents and for, like you guys looking at fertility questions, I would say probably the risk for that sort of thing is incredibly small, like infinitesimal. But you have to ask yourself, how would you sleep if you weren't able to get pregnant or something happened? Would you say it's because the vaccine, whether it's what caused it or not, those are things you have to deal with. But those are rational decisions and rational sort of, calculations you make, like it's a risk benefit thing. Mm-hmm. And what you see as risk and benefit is different than what someone else does. And so I think, at the margins, that's where it becomes tricky. If you're 90 years old, I don't think there's much question that it's smart to get the SARS-CoV-2 vaccine if you've not had it, because your risk is obviously very high. So I don't know. That's the problem with me oftentimes is that it's very nuanced. And so a lot of people on in social media, they don't want not down the middle, but some sort of like thoughtful answer, because they want to like, vaccines are killing everybody, or vaccines aren't killing anybody. COVID's real, COVID-19 is fake. That's sort of what gets the clicks and eyeballs. But in the reality, it's not like that. I think that's when I talked on my Facebook Live, the last one, about this Independence Day. I mean, that's kind of that's why I think a lot of these things are important to keep track of.
Yeah, let's talk about that, because that was an excellent Facebook Live and a great message, with what I'm seeing going on, and with how our governors, your governor in Michigan, Whitmer, and Governor Wolf in Pennsylvania, and Cuomo in New York, and there might be others, but what they're doing is setting these thresholds for percentage of vaccinated. I think they're just saying over 18 or over 17% vaccinated.
No, they're saying everybody.
Is that what they're saying? Maybe
Yeah.
Pennsylvania's that way too. Okay. Right now, I mean, really looking at what the numbers are, I think the numbers in Pennsylvania, and I haven't looked in maybe a week or two, but they were at like, I want to say 60% or so had received at least, one dose. And of that, 50%, or maybe it was 45%, had received the full 2 doses. And in Pennsylvania, the governor has made the threshold, I believe, 70% in order to roll back mask mandates. He's set an arbitrary date in, I think, late May, like May 23rd or something, where he's going to eliminate all other lockdown measures, but leave masks in place if the 70% hasn't been hit. And I know similar things are happening in Michigan, but when you came out and said, and I'll let you elaborate on this, obviously, but June 1st, everyone's had an opportunity who wants to get vaccinated by that point has had that opportunity, and they've gotten it. People who haven't, they're taking that risk, like we just talked about, cost benefit analysis. So what goes into your thought process for why June 1st, and when you say open everything, and what do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, the open anything is actually not very nuanced. That's open everything. That's removing all restrictions. And I mean, if let's just talk numbers. I just looked at the CDC site today just to get an idea. So 153 million Americans have had at least one dose of the vaccine. So that's 46% of Americans. And 115 million are fully vaccinated, which is 35% almost. So over 18, so adults, 18 or older, 150.3 of those million actually are adults. So actually, it's interesting, about almost 3 million are under 18 who have been vaccinated. But that puts us at 58% of Americans of adults have had the vaccination. Those over the age of 65, which we know are the most at risk, it's almost 84%. So not surprisingly, people who are most at risk, who are most worried about this, have been vaccinated, right? Mm-hmm. But again, there's nothing special about a vaccine causing immunity versus getting infected and getting immunity. It's immunity. It doesn't matter where you get it or how you get it. So you have to factor in the natural immunity. Now, we don't really know exactly how many people have had it and cleared it. We have an estimate, and it's anywhere from conservatively from 20 to 30% probably. Varies by region, varies by, age groups and those sorts of things. So we suspect it's about 25%. I mean, if you count those numbers in, we're looking at almost 90% of those who are elderly, 65 and above, mm-hmm. and 69% of those who are adults, and almost 60% of Americans have some sort of immunity. Now, that's probably not enough to cause the herd protection, or we're not going to use the term herd immunity, which is, I think, an improper term. But
why do you think that's an improper term?
Well, herd immunity suggests that you won't ever have outbreaks, and you're going to actually have it's probably not very accurate when it comes to trying to figure out what the likelihood of outbreaks and things are. It's probably herd protection is probably a better way of looking at it. That's Dave Graham goes into that. It's maybe a nomenclature thing, but it's, I think, probably a more accurate idea that you're not going to get large outbreaks, but you're still going to have it present. Herd immunity suggests really that you don't have any sort of presence at all. Like polio, there's really no polio in the United States, right? That I'd say we have herd immunity for polio, mm-hmm. and actually most of the world. But with an endemic disease, you're just not really ever going to get herd immunity, probably, because you're going to have, at any time, you're going to have new people coming in who have no immunity, and you're going to have people who've lost immunity, because if it's like other coronaviruses, it's not going to last forever. It's not unlike the chickenpox or something like that. But so the way I look at it right now, and you could even see this mid-April, I was actually working at a vaccine clinic. I volunteered at a vaccine clinic and jabbed people in the arm. Only had one person faint. It's pretty good. And it was pretty clear by that night that we had turned a corner. Like, it was an inflection point of no longer were we short of vaccines. We were short of people to put the vaccines in. And that had become more clear a couple weeks later. And now there's without a doubt, I mean, you can go to like any drugstore, you can go to grocery stores, whoever has a pharmacy, they have vaccines that they're willing to give you. It's not a matter of supply issues at this point. And again, we're just focusing on the United States. We're not going to talk about other countries, which is an entirely different situation. So right now, if you want immunity, you have two ways of getting it. One is you get infected, or maybe you've previously been infected. Two, you get vaccinated. Those are your only two options. I mean, those are the only two options you ever have. But if you want immunity, you can get it, and you can get a full immunity before the end of this month, even if you just decide to do it. So if you don't have immunity by the end of this month, it's a choice you've made. We're also at the point where one of the concerns early on was that we're going to overwhelm the healthcare systems. I work in the hospital all the time. We've had two huge surges in the state of Michigan. What often happens to these surges, they happen and they sort of just fade away. No matter what you do, you see this everywhere. And you could have a long discussion about, non-pharmacologic interventions and, masking and lockdowns and stuff. But either way, no matter what you do, it kind of just comes and goes. The hospitals get really full. Sometimes you have to cancel surgeries. You have to cancel some sort of procedures, but it kind of goes away and ebbs and flows. And we're at the point now, especially when you look at those numbers. I mean, we're guessing at least 65% of all Americans, 60% have some sort of immunity to SARS-CoV-2. There's not that much fuel left, especially at the rate people are getting vaccinated at this point. And I'm sure a lot of kids will get vaccinated, with some parents will make that choice. We're going to get to the point pretty soon where we're not going to hit where we can't really overwhelm the healthcare system. In fact, I say we're probably already there now. We never really got overwhelmed anywhere. We're not like India. We don't have people dying because they don't have oxygen. I mean, it's really bad there because they don't have the resources. They're not as rich. I think, Jason Stapleton always talks about, it sucks to be poor. We're not poor.
Well, and their population is just so concentrated. I mean,
sure. Yeah. It's going to spread more. But I think, the biggest problem is they just don't have basic, resources to take care of people, to get most people over this. Well, we don't have that problem. Nowhere has it been like we're short of ventilators. We had all sorts of plans in place, which I think was rational, to say, what do we do if it gets really bad? We're going to convert our operating rooms to ICUs. We're going to convert our surgical centers to ICUs. We got ventilators there. We can run these things. People figured out ways. It's actually really interesting. If you go on YouTube, you can see anesthesiologists who figured out ways to run to use a ventilator to ventilate for three people at the same time. Like, it's actually combined. So there are workarounds people had. We never even came close to needing that, right? Trump ordered all those ventilators, had Ford Motor Company and GM making, they want to justify their, their corporate welfare. So they, built all these ventilators.
I remember Cuomo asked Trump for some just absurd amount of ventilators. Right. And Trump's like, no, you're not getting them ventilators.
Right. And we never needed them, right? They never even used all the ventilators in New York. Never even came close, partly because we realized that it didn't help for the most part. But anyway, at this point, I think it'd be hard to argue that we're ever going to get overwhelmed in this country with COVID in any part of the country. If that's the case, then the only justification for not having everything open up, I don't know. I don't understand what it would be, because if you want protection, you got it. Vaccines, are highly effective. We know that if you've had COVID, you're going to be safe for the most part. And again, if we're getting to the point where we're talking about lightning strike scenarios where those are the odds, I think, you just have to accept the fact that the risk for driving around is probably more than dying from COVID. I mean, if that's the case, it doesn't make any sense, right? To keep everything locked down. And so that's why I think June 1st gives everyone a reasonable time to get everything they want done. And if that's the case, then just say, you know what, we're all adults. And if we're not adults, we're, adults move us around, do things for us. But at this point, I think you should be open, because kids really, they don't get so sick that we have to worry, I think, a ton about it. Not to say no one worries, but anyway, that's why I say that I don't see any justification for keeping things closed down at this point. And I think when governors use the 70% rate, it's totally arbitrary, and it does not at all take into account the fact that there's natural immunity within the community. And so that's why it's a bad idea. And it's why also vaccine passports, aside from being a civil liberty issue, are also not very useful, because they don't even capture the full, immunity level in the community, which is what you really care about.
Yeah, well, there's vaccine passports, and there's this new thing being floated, which I think the two New York baseball teams have talked about this. I've heard it talked about other places. I think some NBA teams are doing it, where they have a vaccinated and an unvaccinated section in the ballpark, which to me kind of is pretty anti-science, because why would you want to put all of the unvaccinated people together? That's just promoting spread, if there is any, right? Wouldn't you want to mix in some vaccinated people?
That's actually good. I hadn't thought about that. That's actually really, That's a really good point. But again, that just goes to the point that it's not based on science, right? At this point, we're just arguing about, I mean, I think it's the drawdown, right? The hardest thing to do is once you've put a protection in place is to say, you know what, we don't need this anymore. For right now, for instance, a great example is for us in our medical clinics, we have to do temperature checks every day. I don't know how many businesses still do this. I'm guessing most of them don't do it.
Mine does. Yeah.
Yeah. But our Occupational Safety Health Administration, MIOSHA in Michigan, requires that of all healthcare facilities. We know that temperature checks don't really catch anything. I mean, it's not really of any sort of use. We've known this for a long time, much like cleaning surfaces doesn't make much difference besides keep your place cleaner. Yet once you set those in place, if you're a bureaucrat, you've got to say, well, you got to be 100% sure that you're not making that if something happens, you're going to say, why'd you remove that restriction? Obviously it was saving lives. And so that's going to be the hardest part about this, people just walking it back. But I think, the nice thing is I think people are really just truly fed up with it. And I think you even seen people on the left who are also tired of it too. And, thinking people, they're just like, it doesn't make any sense. Wearing a mask while you're, hiking in the woods. It never made any sense to have a mask while you're outside, unless you're making out with someone, but then why would you want a mask?
Exactly. They never made any sense to me at all. But I've also seen, and I don't know how prevalent this is, this might just be some very far left people who say they're reluctant to take their mask off, even outside, because they don't want to be looked at as maybe a Trump supporter or something, walking around without a mask on. So that's the craziness we're dealing with now.
Yeah.
So a couple more quick topics I wanted to get your opinion on with regards to COVID. So at-home test kits. Do you have any idea why we don't have these already, other than just the FDA just fumbling and not being able to approve them? Or is there some other medical reasons why we don't have quick at-home COVID tests, or SARS-CoV-2 tests, I should say?
I would say the main reason for that is the FDA and its unwillingness to relinquish sort of control over the testing process. They have as many people may know, that the FDA no longer, its role is mainly safety. It's actually more efficacy, which means how effective something works or doesn't work. And so the most expensive part of drug development is actually not most of the testing. It's the very last phase of testing where you have to prove that it actually works, and you have to use, how well does that blood pressure medicine work, or how well does the vaccine work? I mean, we knew these vaccines were effective a long time ago. Really, it was just delayed months and months and months, which you could argue tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people died because of that, because the FDA insisted on these sort of other, phases of the trial, which didn't really matter. But anyway, that aside, the testing issue is mainly because of the FDA not allowing it. I think secondarily, it's probably the medical community too. And there's a lot of hesitancy within the medical community to allow people to do testing on their own, because there's a concern that they will misinterpret it, or they'll get information that is not accurate. Like, if you did the nasopharyngeal swabs, I don't know if anyone's ever had one. I have not personally, but I've seen them done, and my kids have had them done, where they just, the Q-tip goes up like into, people say, rubs on your cerebellum, and then you pull it out and you test it. But if you don't do that properly, it doesn't work. And so there's a concern with like spit tests or whatever, that people would just interpret improperly. I mean, home pregnancy tests, people would think it's like a common thing, but it was a prescription testing device for a long time. It wasn't until, I don't know, was it the 80s maybe, or late 70s, where they actually were allowed to be sold over the counter, because, it's really hard to see a plus symbol or a negative symbol if you're not trained in medicine. Maybe they're more complicated. They had 2 lines or 1 line, but I mean, there's just a hesitancy in our highly regulated medical system to allow people to interpret tests on their own, because they may get things wrong. And I deal with this. I'm in the medical society, and we see this all the time, where people don't want certain innovations to happen because people are going to have not too much power, but there's a concern they may misinterpret, or they may miss things that they would be picked up by a professional. And there may be some truth in that, but it probably stifles a lot of innovation, things that might be more helpful in the generally than it would be to protect people.
Yeah. I mean, the biggest thing to me that I think was fumbled, and you could blame Trump, but it's probably more just the bureaucracy and the unwillingness to hand that over, like you were just talking about. But when things were really bad, you talk about last fall or into the winter, with, like I said, that was our worst run up with deaths and hospitalizations. I mean, if you could just, even if people were only getting it right half the time, If you were able to put those tests in their hands, that would have helped tremendously. Because I mean, you factor that on top of people who, even if it was a false test, automatically you're being more cautious yourself. You're self isolating, and you're taking yourself out of out of possibility of circulating it. So I think that was just a huge fumble. The other big one was at the beginning when the FDA would not approve the original test, and they waited for their own test, right, which then was faulty, right, when they rolled it out.
Yeah, I mean, from a regulatory standpoint, that's where the problem is. And you're absolutely right. I think, if people had the ability to do it at their home, they're going to be able to, my wife has it. Maybe I should test myself every day to make sure I don't get it. I'm, trying to stay away from her, whatever. And you're going to have, you're definitely going to stop the spread a lot faster than if you had done something and had that ability to use it. And as we've seen, I mean, most of those rapid tests are actually still pretty accurate. It's not 99% or whatever the PCR test might be for picking up, particles and stuff. And I don't want to go into talk about cycle times. You can listen to one of my shows. I talk about that, and I certainly understand the concern there. But as far as the sensitivity, the rapid tests are still pretty good. I mean, my wife does them all the time because now in Michigan they have to require all the high school athletes to get tested weekly, even if you're playing some high impact sport like golf, and they're actually. She has had tons of positive tests, and when they do the PCR, the confirmatory, it's always positive. And so they haven't had any false negatives. Doesn't mean that they're false positives. Doesn't mean there aren't any, but it's still a pretty accurate test. And so it would have been a very helpful tool because it would have been much better than 50%. It would probably been still about 90% or so.
Right. All right. Just one more question here. I think the fear that a lot of libertarians have, a lot of people who just, lean towards liberty in general, there's been this infringement on our rights with lockdowns. They were very slow to be, rolled back. A lot of them still aren't rolled back in many states. And then with masks, a lot of states still have some sort of mask mandate. And one fear that I have is that they've been normalized to a certain extent that I think some people just voluntarily on their own are going to continue to wear them. And I think if they want to do it, that's them. They can do that. My bigger concern would be when we look at flu seasons in the future, masks becoming a standard thing every fall and winter, that when kids are going to school or in the workplace, you're around people, you're at a sporting event, that you have to wear a mask. Do you think that's something that'll happen? And what's your opinion on that?
I think that sort of prediction is really hard to make.
That's what I do. I make wild predictions. Then if it happens, then I look like a genius.
Right. Well, I mean, and I say that just, because I really don't know where we're going. I mean, I think I was just on another show yesterday or 2 days ago, and I really feel like we're rounding third base and we're heading towards home, and we're just about done with this thing. And I, call a lot of these people who are insisting that we keep everything the same as like the third base coach, but we just need to blow through the signal and just head home. And so right now, use a baseball analogy. But when it comes to mask usage, I think it's a lot like if it's cold out, right? Like it's 50 degrees or 40 degrees. It makes sense to wear a sweater. And so you wear a sweater, but you don't take a sweater with you in July, right? Because it's the likelihood of you actually needing it is pretty much zero, right? Or it's like taking an umbrella when there's no cloud in the sky. So it may be that it gets normalized where we say, you know what, sort of culturally, we accept the fact that if you're sick or you come in with a cold or something, or you might have the flu, you're feeling kind of under the weather, maybe you do wear a mask around. I mean, that seems pretty rational to me. It seems pretty normal. And I think that's actually probably a good thing to do. How much it helps and stuff, we can argue about that, but probably it's a good idea if you're going to go out.
That's what a lot of Asian cultures previously did, right? I think that was kind of misinterpreted, right? That they would wear them strategically. If you were sick, you would wear a mask. And it kind of got interpreted over here that they always wore masks all the time. Right. That's how they stopped it.
Right. Well, and I think, there are other reasons to wear masks, like it's smoggy and you don't want to breathe as much, smog. So there are all sorts of reasons. So I think it's possible that we'll get to a point where we're going to be wearing them at specific times, like you said, strategically. I don't believe that we're going to have it required, like, oh, it's November, it's flu season time, everyone put on their masks and, don't stand next to people, and, oh, better not get married in December because we can't have weddings. Or, if you're in DC, you can't dance at your wedding. I don't think we're going to have those sorts of rules. I don't know what's going to happen in the hospital. I mean, everything in the regulatory standpoint from the healthcare, it's just weird. And so we have lots of things that just persist. But there are lots of rules that what happens is people just don't pay attention to them. And as you know, as a libertarian, the rule only matters if people actually are following them, right? I mean, if everyone decided they're not going to wear masks tomorrow, well, no one would be wearing masks, right? You could have, there aren't enough cops in the world. There aren't enough people. And they're probably, if that many people decide they're not wearing masks, well, no one's going to enforce it. I mean, no one's going to be at the store. If 10 people walk in, none of them have masks on. Chances are that person at the door is like, yeah, it's stupid. I'm not going to, tell you to leave my store or something like that. And so a lot of these rules will kind of go away. This happens all the time in the hospital. Even we're highly regulated and probably shouldn't even be saying this, but there are rules that get imposed and they're followed for a while. And then people say, yeah, that's dumb. And so we're just not going to do it anymore. Yeah. And they just don't do it. And then, the regulator comes in and said, why are you not doing X, Y, Z? And so then you say, okay, well, so you start doing it again. And then after a while, people are saying, yep, it's dumb still. And so we're going to stop doing it again. And so there are all kinds of things that happen like that, whether it goes from jaywalking, like everyone does, or, you don't jaywalk across the freeway, but you can do it across an empty street, right? I mean, there's people have common sense and they have certain levels of risk and benefit. They sort of, whatever it might be. And I think that's what will happen. I do not believe that we're going to be stuck in this lockdown. I think we're very close to being over. We're lucky we live in a federalized system where we have various experiments as far as, what sort of measures people are doing to try and prevent control spread. And you see that there's probably not much difference, right? I think it's sort of pretty random what's going on. And you see people, I don't care what your politics are, but if you see people who are just going out and doing their business normally, you kind of want to be that person, right? I mean, you don't want to continue living the nightmare if you can avoid it. There are some people who, of course, insist on wearing the mask like it is a MAGA hat. And it's very similar, I think, as far as a symbol. But I think that will go away soon. And, you can just eventually, the cognitive dissonance sort of works its way out and you say, well, the liberals saved us. And so I can take off my mask now or something like that. I mean, that's what will probably happen because people are just not going to want to do this forever.
Well, I think you hit on a good point there, talking about if you see people out living their life, you're going to want to do that too. And I think one thing that is driving this discussion from the left for vaccine passports is you have these progressives looking at a state like Florida, all these people that are out there, living their life, just Texas, doing whatever they want, and nothing bad is happening. I mean, like you said, SARS, it's basically the same everywhere. So there's not a bad impact. I mean, it's kind of leveled off across the country. But when it comes to vaccine passports, it looks like the left wants, or I don't know if they will do this. They want to try to use it as okay, well, we're vaccinated. We can go out there, but anyone who's not, you have to stay at home. We can have the fun. You can watch us have fun. And I don't know if that'll happen. I really pray that it doesn't. And I really agree with your friend, Justin Amash. He was one of the first people to come out from the Liberty side when the vaccine passport discussion was just heating up, and really pointing out the flaws and how dangerous they are, not only for if they were government implemented from the public sector, but also if the private sector does it. That's not something as, liberty lovers, as libertarians, that we should be getting behind. It's not a free market idea, and it can easily, like we've seen, much like with social media, when you have Facebook and Twitter and the Googles of the world that regulate free speech, sort of as these private enterprises that act as arms of the government. That can easily happen with the vaccine passports. With, like in New York, a private company like IBM creates the vaccine passports, and then the government can say, well, that's not us, that's this private company just offering the service, and then they just mine the database and pull all the data out.
Well, I would just add that as much as I'll try and be optimistic here, because I think it's important to point out how much better the world is in some ways, and it's not as doom and gloom as we may think. So I think, just recently I've been looking at this stuff with Facebook and Apple fighting each other, right, through privacy with data collection and metadata and those sorts of things. And you see, now I don't know what the ideological breakdown is of people who are in favor of more privacy or less privacy, but you're seeing it's like 96% of people who get iPhones choose not to have data tracked. So I think that suggests to me most people don't really want that. And so I tend to think, and those are got to be all political parts of the spectrum, right? But most Americans do not want to have their whereabouts and all their private things collected and held by, whether it's this is private companies, but they certainly don't want the government either. So I'm much more favorable. I mean, I think, bureaucrats want to do what they want to do. And I don't think that they will have much, they're not going to have much ability to really push it forward because, like I said, I think whether they want it or not, I think COVID's kind of coming to an end here. And, it's going to be more and more evident as we get further into June and July, when the amount of people who have it, the amount of really problems in the hospitals is just less and less. And so, I mean, already you're seeing all the stories. They're not about the United States, right? Now they're all about other parts of the world because it's kind of, thankfully to the vaccine and the natural immunity. I mean, if it weren't for the vaccine, whether you like it or not as a libertarian, that causes our immunity levels to go up really quickly, and it probably saved us a good 2-3 years from having to deal with these, continuous waves that just would keep coming and going all the time. And the impetus for these lockdowns, these rules, has really gone away. And that's largely because of the vaccine, whether you like it or not.
Yeah. Okay, Eric, wrapping things up here. Just want to give you some time to plug your podcast, to plug anything else you're working on, and let the people know where they can find that podcast.
Yeah, well, I would appreciate you can check me out on Twitter. I'm not super active on there at the Paradocs Show, and Paradocs is spelled DOCS, so PARADOCS, and it's theparadox.com. You can find my website with access to all my shows. I've had 127, 128 is coming out. This is going to be on COVID as well. I try not to talk about COVID all the time because all I do is talk about in the OR. I have nurses ask me all the time what they should do, whether they should get vaccinated. It's actually having podcasts. It makes you sort of a semi-expert. And so people want your opinion all the time. And I always have to say, I don't know. So sometimes I do know or have a good idea, but we talk about this third-party healthcare system, the insanity of it. And the really great thing about it that I think about the show that has been good for me is when I started in 2018, I was very pessimistic about the U.S. healthcare system. I thought it was, going the wrong way. It was third-party payers, government payers, were all colluding against physicians and against patients. And we're in trouble from a quality standpoint, from payment standpoint. But I have met so many people who are disruptive to the system. So many people have found alternatives to getting around things, whether it's a Keith Smith at Oklahoma City Surgery Center, whether it's direct primary care physicians, whether it's people who are finding ways of getting around, basically, setting up free market ER centers or telehealth. There are all kinds of people doing really cool, innovative things. And so there's a lot of energy in solving these problems because really, as you probably, since you're libertarian, you're not going to think that the solutions are rarely coming from legislation from the state capital or the nation's capital. Solutions generally come from the bottom up, things we can't even imagine or understand or begin to expect. And yet that's what's happening. So it's been a very encouraging show. I think you can learn some interesting things, whether you're into medicine, because about half my listeners are physicians, half aren't. And so I think it's a great way to get some things, information. I've done some stuff on history, on forced organ harvesting, pretty much about anything, brain death, anything you can think of. So I'd encourage people to come by and check it out. And thank you again for letting me finish the triathlon here on the the Freedom Friday show to do a clean sweep here of the Alliance of Liberty podcast network.
Yeah, you're one of the few that's been on all three. I think there's one or two other ones, but it's been great having you on, Eric. Great getting to talk with you. Keep up the great work. And, you're saying that you've become an expert in this by doing all these podcasts. I think the perspective you bring it's necessary for the just the general discourse on social media that gets so toxic, and for people to see your opinion. So keep it up.
I appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Hope you all enjoyed that interview on Finding Freedom. Another awesome guest. And hopefully you guys also have subscribed to the Lions of Liberty podcast, and you're getting all three of our unique shows in your little listening device delivered to your ears. If you haven't, please do that. Just go to your app, you know how to do it, and subscribe. You can also leave us a 5-star review and a nice comment. We would prefer if you did it on Apple Podcasts, but anywhere you can on the internet, please leave us a positive comment. Also, if you want to support us, we would love that too. Please go to patreon.com/Lions of Liberty. You can support us for as little as a couple bucks, or if you get in at a higher level, you get merchandise and access to us and all the way up to you can advertise on the show or get to even produce a show. So check it all out, patreon.com/Lions of Liberty. And if you haven't checked it out yet, please consider checking out the Lions of Liberty store, where we have some awesome t-shirts. We have a Taxation is Death t-shirt with an awesome design. We have a Wax On, Tax Off t-shirt. And we're always coming up with new ideas and adding new t-shirt designs to the store. Check that out at lionsofliberty.store. And if you're in the Pride, you get a discount on anything you buy in the store. So you do both of those things and you win. That's all I got, everyone. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. This is John Odermatt signing off. Always remember to keep your head up and the fires of liberty burning.